Yeah, so welcome to Wildlife in Focus, reflecting on 2024 and shaping 2025. I do want to acknowledge the traditional owners. So we work across the World Heritage Area, the Greater Blue Mountains World Heritage Area, which includes 6 different language groups, coming to you today from the Gundungurra lands and Durug, but we work across a much broader area, which you'll see on the map later. So I'd like to pay my respects and thank them for their custodianship of country, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging as well. Right, in terms of what we're going to go through this evening, there's a bit of an outline that I'm going to be taking you through. We've been going now for 10 years and a lot of our projects are built on previous work. And so I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction to our approach for the people that are new, then recap some of our results over the last years, which kind of are the platform for what we've been focusing on this year. And then we'll also go into our plans for 2025. So in terms of what we do, we work in partnership. It's very much at the core of our approach. So we work with communities, landowners and land managers, and across land tenures. So you do have NGOs, for example, like AWC, the Australian Wildlife Conservancy, that work in fenced areas, targeting certain small threatened species, and they fence out feral animals. We work across land tenures, including national park and developed lands, as you can see in some of the pictures here. Because wildlife, naturally move across those boundaries, and it's really important to try and mitigate the edge effects. So even if you have animals within the World Heritage Area, you still need to be able to stop the offtake when they go into higher risk zones. So that's very much a part of our approach and why we rely on partnerships so heavily as well. So we're very much about doing the research that gets applied on the ground for conservation outcomes, and we work across fences, without fences. And in terms of what we do too, the way we try and get the biggest bang for the conservation buck is working with indicator, keystone, flagship and umbrella species. So some of you might be familiar with some of these terms. Indicator species, as you can see here, we did have a bit of fun with AI getting these illustrations together. It's amazing what you can do. An indicator species, for example, might be a frog. So frogs are pretty famous for being sensitive to pollution. So if you start seeing frogs disappearing from a waterway, you know there's a problem. So they're indicating an issue. Keystone species, if you think of an archway, it's like a keystone in the very top of that arch. And if you take that keystone out, the whole system can collapse. And so keystone predators or apex predators like dingoes, wolves are classic examples. There's a really nice video. I don't know if you've seen it or not, but I recommend it. It's about how wolves change rivers, and it just goes to the impacts of when a predator disappears from the system, how it affects the prey, that affects the vegetation, and that even affects watercourses. Then you have umbrella species, of which the koala is one. You can see there. And umbrella species basically cover a really wide area. So they will roam over general habitats. And if you're conserving them, so for example, with the koalas, and it's one of the reasons we work with them, is that they use a wide range of eucalypt habitats, especially in this area. And that means by conserving those habitats, we help conserve a whole range of other species as well. And so, yeah, you're working with a single species project, but hopefully getting benefits right down the trophic levels of the ecosystem. And then flagship species are just the cute and fluffies, essentially. So think of the panda iconic logo for WWF. They're really good species for engaging communities and getting them involved in conservation as a sort of a stepping stone to then bring them into other work as well. So the power of the koala is quite impressive in that regard. In terms of our conservation themes, so we work across a range of themes. And we developed these last year. So last year was our 10-year anniversary of the organisation, and we did some strategic planning, and these are the 5 themes that are guiding our work. I'm just going to admit someone who's comment. And so, yeah, every project we do now fits into one of these themes. So the first one was our flagship project, which is iconic koalas and habitats. And I'll be talking more about that tonight, around our Greater Blue Mountains project with koalas and a couple of other things we've been doing. Then we've got threatened keystone and indicator species, which I've just explained. We've had a variety of projects on that, particularly a camera trapping project looking at critical weight range mammals, which I'll also be speaking about a bit more tonight, because we're hoping to get something back on the ground for that last year. So we've finished a stage 1 for this project. This project's just been building and going on, and we've got lots of different streams running over it over the last 10 years. When we get to building ecosystem resilience, that's very much around engaging the community. So going back around that cross-tenure approach. For example, if we're working with Landcare, one of our partners this year was Mulgoa Landcare, who are doing some great work on the ground restoring koala habitats. And so we feed our research into that and tell them, which trees to plant and what the priority areas are. So, to build true ecosystem resilience, it's got to have community support and support of a wide range of partners. It can be on-ground works like that, or it could be information sharing. And so, for example, just omitting someone else as well. And so, for example, we built a Help Wildlife Near Me app, which was co-designed with 13 different stakeholder organisations up here a few years ago. Anybody who's just joined, could I ask you just to put your microphone on mute, please? And we can have a chat after the presentation. That's right. So then we've also got our post-rehab project, as we call it. We've got a theme around informing wildlife rehabilitation. That project that started that theme has been completed. It was a really great project, ran over 3 years with National Parks and Wildlife. But we are hopefully going to get more involved in that sector as well. There's some real knowledge gaps around what happens to animals after they've been through rehab and whether they survive and how the rehabilitation process affects them. And so, yeah, it's a really important knowledge gap that we hope to do more work in. And then we've got Science for Wildlife Zambia, which was registered about 12 months ago. We've set up an NGO in Zambia, a branch of Science for Wildlife. And I'll touch on that tonight. Hopefully we're going to be more active on the ground next year with that one. So it's in fundraising stages. There's been a lot of work going into getting government support and building a proposal for donors over in Zambia for that one. So that's they're just sample projects of the things that fall under those themes. And so they're existing projects, some are completed, some we've done a stage 1 and we're looking to do a stage 2. And some we're just initiating. So we do have a broad scope across a range of different activities. So in terms of who we work with, we do a lot of collaboration. As I mentioned, that's a real key or core to the model approach that we take. And so we work with public land managers, particularly because we're working in the World Heritage Area and national parks. So we work with all levels of government, from local through to regional, through to state and Commonwealth. Including quite a lot with local councils and local land services and national parks. We also work with the World Heritage Advisory Committee, and they're our key liaison, along with national parks for traditional owner groups. Then when we get to the animal welfare sector, we work with animal welfare organisations like WIRES and the International Fund for Animal Welfare, I4. We've also worked with RSPCA and Blue Arc on the Help Wildlife and ME app. Then we have research partners, universities that you can see listed there, particularly to do with disease and genetic studies. So I'll give you, and we've got zoos, other not-for-profits and communities, and I'll just give you a couple of examples of the project. So that post-rehab project that I was talking about, that was actually in partnership with national parks. They came to us asking us to deliver that project for them. And then we worked really closely with WIRES and I4, who both provided some funding, and the WIRES koala rehabilitators were also really active. We're working with them. They told us when they had koalas coming into care. And so we could then monitor them after care and give feedback on what their fate was and how well they did. Then we're doing quite a lot of genomics. We do have a Commonwealth level genomics project, which we're running with James Cook Uni, looking at koala populations right across the species range. And then on a local level, we also collect scats and swab and test koalas in this local area. We get those samples run at the University of Sydney at the Koala Health Hub. Then we've got Groot, who I'll be talking about a little bit more later. Some of you might have seen him in the recent newsletter. Our scat detection dog. We've had a couple of other dogs working as well. And so, for example, zoos have been important to that, not only in supporting our work, but also to train a dog, you need poop, and you can't always get koala poop or tiger quoll poop easily. And so the zoos can provide fresh scat for us for the training. And then residents and communities very much involved. In fact, we've got some of our hardcore volunteers hit here this evening, which is nice to see. We ran a project a couple of years ago now called Backstreet Bellows, where we actually had 200 landholders, 100 either side of the Great Dividing Range around this area, putting out these little acoustic monitors. And then the Help Wildlife NIMIAT, which I mentioned, all of these different groups were involved. So very collaborative approach. But 2024 year, so last year was the anniversary of our organisation, and 2024 is the anniversary of our Blue Mountains Koala Project. And so that was a big focus of our work this year. And so I'll take you through a little bit of background on where we've got to and then what we've actually delivered this year. So some of you might be a bit familiar with this content, but there's some new faces as well. So I'll just give you a bit of a background. And in terms of where we started, it was really quite interesting. There was the bushfires back in 2013, and koalas were seen for the first time in decades, particularly in the lower Blue Mountains. They just popped up. But even chatting to people then, the general consensus was there wasn't going to be a lot of koalas in the Blue Mountains World Heritage Area because it's sandstone country. And sandstone country is known as a poor soil type. And so you don't expect a lot of koalas. They've been pretty famous for liking good soils. So even with occasional sightings coming through, the general consensus was, you know, they might just be moving through or they might be really low density. It's not going to be an important area. But that's certainly not what we found. This is now my favorite slide to give people an overview of what goes on across the species range and why koalas are different, or how koalas are different. Highly scientific approach. We're pretty sure that the koalas in the Blue Mountains are the best looking in the country. And so we have got a scientific graph together for you to have a look at. On the y-axis here, you'll see koala size, and then down on the x-axis, you've got floofiness, which is a combination of fluffy and floofy. Cute, sorry. Fluffy and cute makes floofy. Now, if you look up in the top corner with the Victorian and South Australian koalas, they're really big. So they're up in the highest end of the size. They get up to about 16 kilos, I think is the new record from South Australia. And we call that the oversized and inbreeding zone. They are very large koalas. Unfortunately, back in the fur trade days, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, koalas were hunted to almost extinction in Victoria. And there was just a few animals taken to French Island, and they then bred in really big numbers, and they've been translocated across the state. So a lot of the koalas there do have abnormalities, genetic abnormalities from inbreeding. So they're very floofy, but they're a bit too big, and some of them are quite strange in terms of the best looking scale. Then you go down into Queensland.
What
was that? Frank and Sylvia, are you piping in on that?
No. Sorry, accident.
We're going to argue about that later. Down in the Queensland side, you've got much smaller koalas. So the males up there only get to 8 kilos, so literally half the size. So small and cute, but they don't have a high floofiness factor because it's a very hot climate. They've got quite thin fur, so they're adapted to warmer weather. And then in the middle of everything, in what I call the Goldilocks zone, just right, you've got your New South Wales koalas, which is sort of still quite small. And then you get up into the Blue Mountains and the floofiness increases. So we do have koalas up in Canangra Boyd that are very fluffy. They get snowed on in winter. And so this theory actually is building. I have had Taronga Zoo and state government out at Canangra Boyd. I did warn them how healthy and good looking the koalas were. And they were actually all very surprised and completely agreed with me. And I do have a slide here just with a bit of proof for you. Hang on. There we go. So that is Pluto. He's a joey from Canangra Boyd National Park, up where it gets very cold in winter. So that's a bit of an overview of the size and climate differences for koalas for you. So this is the area we've been working over 10 years. It's slowly built up. So we've got 5 sites plus a new site, which I'll talk about, which we've just been surveying this year. We started off down in the Hawkesbury southeast Wallamai, near to where the first koala sightings were after the 2013 bushfires, and we were getting reports up around the back of Bilpin kind of area. So we went to check it out and camped out overnight and just heard all these male koalas bellowing within a few kilometres. So things kicked off there. Then we moved into Canangra Boyd National Park, and again, I think a koala had been seen on a camera trap in that area. Just down on where they're reintroducing brush-tailed rock wallabies, it was seen climbing a pole on the enclosure. So we got a bit of a tip-off they might be in the area. we went down there and saw how incredibly steep the country was and inaccessible for radio tracking koalas. There's just sheer cliffs everywhere. So we went a little bit further north, and we're very surprised to find what is now a booming population. The numbers were lower then. That was back in 2017, but those numbers have been building over time. And then after the bushfires, we had these 5 sites identified. I had this great idea that we'll probably do 1 site a year and we'll be done in 5 years. It'll be an interesting project to run. But every time we complete work there, we get all these interesting questions, like the koalas are doing such interesting things. And so the project just keeps expanding. So we had different sites identified because the area is so diverse, and I'll go into that in a minute. And so we've had ecological studies where we're radio tracking koalas at these, and then we've had distribution studies where we're doing surveys to find out where the koalas are across all these other sites. And then this year, and a lot of this comes off community sightings. It's really important. I mean, the World Heritage Area is 1 million hectares in size. And so knowing where to start for surveys is too big to survey all at once, and it's, pretty remote and inaccessible. And so we get reports from people saying, I've seen a koala here. And while it's quite biased to, near houses and roads where people are going to see koalas, it gives us an idea that, 1, they might be in the area, and 2, what sort of tree or vegetation type they were seen in, so that we can then go and survey that in remote areas. And that's exactly what's happened up in the Midwestern region, which I'll talk about a little bit more tonight. So in terms of the importance of the broader region for koalas, it is a really fascinating area. So the Blue Mountains, the Greater Blue Mountains World Heritage Area, one of the outstanding values that resulted in the World Heritage listing is the incredible diversity of eucalypts and eucalypt habitats. So there's close to 100 species of eucalypt here, which is more food tree choice than koalas have compared to anywhere else in the country. And so we can learn a lot about what they're choosing and why they're choosing here that can apply to other sites. We've also got really different microclimates. So we've got elevation from almost close to sea level at 40 metres up to over 1,200 metres in altitude. So completely different temperatures, different rainfall, moisture levels, and totally different tree species as well. And yeah, so it's really fascinating. And because we've got that comparison, if we can find drivers that are common in terms of what drives koala occupancy across the landscape, across such diverse sites, it's likely to apply in other areas as well. And so we have learned a lot of really interesting things. So in terms of our early outputs for koalas, you can see one here, where they're absolutely rule-breaking koalas here. So I was talking earlier about them really liking good soil types and nobody thinking, they'd be around in the World Heritage Area. They've thrown that out the window. They haven't read the literature on what koalas should be doing. So the good news is that, koalas have been uplisted to endangered in recent years. And that means that a lot of the populations across the species range are declining. So it doesn't apply to the Victorian, South Australian populations, but for New South Wales, ACT and Queensland, they've been in, fairly rapid decline for some years. But what we're finding is growing populations in these areas. So areas where you haven't had koalas recorded for decades, and then suddenly there was a few sightings, and then suddenly people are saying, we hear them all the time over the last 10 years, and then they've got Fred and Mary, who they've named, living in their backyard. So And our work around surveys and ecological studies is backing that up. They are emerging populations, which is really exciting. Part of that national scale genomics study work that we did with James Cook University, which is still ongoing, we're doing some more work on that, but we've published a couple of papers, and one of them was looking at the level of genetic diversity across the country, so from far north Queensland right down to South Australia. And the highest level of genetic diversity was found in the Blue Mountains area, which is really interesting. It seems to be in the middle of what we call an admixture zone, where you've got a northern clade and a southern clade coming together. We've also identified 2 areas of chlamydia-free koalas, and chlamydia is a disease that can hit them really badly, depending on the area. Sometimes they can carry it a little bit more down in Victoria, but certainly New South Wales and up in Queensland, it causes mortality rates. There was a population in Gunnedah that recently went functionally extinct. It was in fragmented habitats, but also had really bad cases of chlamydia. The prevalence went through the population, kept increasing till they just stopped seeing any new joeys coming through, because it will sterilise the females in particular. So it was exciting that we found 2 chlamydia-free koala populations, one in Canangra Boyd and one in Newnes Plateau. And then, the rule breaking, they're on really poor soil types up on the sandstone ridgelines. A really nice example is, there's been some modelling done, early modelling, and as more koalas are found, the models get updated, but the early modelling was around a particular species of tree called the silver-top ash. And some researchers found that wherever you find that, and the more of it you find, the less likely you are to find any koalas. Yet up in Canangra Boyd, it's one of their preferred food tree species. So so we're going to try and get them some samples to find out why. So different soil types, poor soils, and totally different trees. Every site we go to, we find them using different tree species. And even within the one study site, one koala might be on a shale cap soil and another one 200 meters away will be on a sandstone ridgeline, and they'll both be using totally different trees. So the exciting thing is we are finding that they can use a lot more habitats than we thought, which means they've got more areas to expand into than we thought as well. And when you look back at the fur trade days, it does make sense. Back in sort of the early 1900s, I think the estimate was around 3 to 5 million koalas were shot just in a few years on the East Coast. So we're looking at less than 300,000 of the whole species left now. So when you think of those numbers, they were everywhere. It makes sense that they can use a lot of habitats. There were historical records of them being hunted down in the lower Blue Mountains and also across in the Megalong Valley too. So in terms of more recent times, I'm sure you all remember the extreme mega fires of 2019, 2020. And so that impact and the climate change and everything else around that has really been driving our work for the last few years since then. This is just a bit of a figure showing the problem. So you can see that one mega fire year is defined by an area of greater than 1 million hectares burning in any 1 year. So prior to 2001, there's a single mega fire year. And then since then, there's been 3 since 2001. And you can see this figure from the CSIRO, that as the area that's burned gets bigger, you get into the darker reds. And you can see over time, in the most recent years, that more and more areas burning as things warm up. So we know that we're going to expect more frequent and intense bushfires. And that's an ongoing problem. And so we did a lot of work around those fires, which our long-term supporters will be aware of. We actually carried out the first emergency evacuation of koalas in front of approaching fire because we were worried about losing all the koalas we just uncovered in Canangra Boyd. And we did a lot of on-ground work doing search and rescue, putting out food and water stations for various species as well. And some of the volunteers here tonight helped with that too. So I won't go too much into that side of things. Beyond that immediate emergency response, the next question was, well, if fires are going to be that big, 80% of the World Heritage Area was covered by fire. So that's massive. We've had big bushfires up here before, but that's normally just 2 or 3 of the 8 national parks that make up the World Heritage Area burning at once. And we had all 8 go up that year. And so the issue is normally there's a lot of unburnt areas, little patches or edges or whole unburnt sections. And those are areas that animals can recolonize from into the burnt landscape. So this concept of fire refuge is really important. And the fact that we might have to artificially manage it to make sure it still exists under climate change. And so there's a couple of different types of fire refugia. There's ones that provide safety from the direct effects of fire. So just animals not burning, they're safe in the exact time of the fire. Then a bit longer term, animals can persist there for a while. And then the ones we're really interested in are the areas that are big enough and of high enough quality that they can sustain animals so that as the surrounding landscape recovers, they can move back into it. And so a couple of years after the fires, starting 18 months after the fires, we conducted over 350 surveys across 4 of those study sites using both very dedicated volunteers who fossick through the leaf litter with scat sticks with us, and also scat dogs. You can see Smudge here in the photo who was involved in some of that work. So a big thanks to the volunteers who were involved in that. And we had some really interesting results from that work. So we stratified all our surveys based on fire intensity as well as habitat type, and we found an interesting result. So there'd been some earlier research looking at how koalas go after fire, and there's papers out showing that 3 to 5 months after fire they just move in and they eat that epicormic growth, which are the young shoots that just come straight out of the trunks and big branches. We found that even 18 months after fire, it was still they were significantly more in the low burn intensities or the unburnt areas. So the moderate to high fire intensities where the canopy was scorched was still not particularly available to them, even that long after fire. And they're actually shifting from their preferred habitats that we mapped before the fire into less preferred habitats if they were less burnt. And the problem with that is koalas have got some pretty fine energetics. And so if they're having to move greater distances to get into habitat that's not as good and not as nutritious, that can affect their health. They can become more susceptible to disease and all sorts of things. So it can be quite stressful for them. And so we know that protecting fires for a longer time, protecting habitats for a longer time are really important, that you need to protect these refugia for koalas to make sure that they can persist, in low to unburnt patches across the landscape. And the next question is, well, how long? Like, we know you need to protect them for at least 2 years. We still don't know, we need to do another round of surveys now to find out 5 years later, are they back in the high fire intensity areas or not? Looking at the landscape out here, there are some areas that do look like they've recovered well, but there's others that are still just dead trees and no canopy that they're probably not spending much time in. So into 2024, that's sort of the background behind our work. And we've moved one step further. We're still continuing that fire work because it's that long-term question that's really important. And then we've got some other longer-term focus work as well. Just so to give you a snapshot, we've done a lot of on-ground work this year under this program. 126 surveys across our new study site, so the site up north that I showed on the map a little bit earlier. We did floristic surveys and scat surveys up there with Groot, our scat dog. And that's just trying to create a first distribution map of koalas up in that region and also work out which habitats they like to use up there, because you can't conserve them if you don't know what's important to them. Then and so that's that area up near Mudgee in green. Then we've got our ongoing ecological studies. So we continued radio tracking koalas at that low altitude site down in Wallamai. That one goes from 40 to about 300 meters in altitude. And then up in Canangra Boyd, over 1,000 meters in altitude. We're still using those sites to contrast what goes on in the different habitats and microclimates. So we had 119 radio tracking locations, and thank you, I saw Julie here tonight. We've got some really dedicated volunteers that have trained up and gone out to collect that data with us. So it's very much a citizen science project as well. And then we've got a lot of GPS downloads as well. So that's not always as simple as putting a collar on a koala and letting the data come in. We are using a range of different technology because there's still quite a few challenges with some of it. So we still have to go out and download data from GPS collars sometimes. But we are getting some really high quality information, which we then have to clean up and analyze, which we've been doing a lot of this year as well. Then more recently, it's been koala bellowing season, which starts around late August, early September. And we've been working across 2 different projects deploying acoustic monitors, so like those little backstreet bellows things. So it's basically a song meter. You put it out in the bush for a couple of weeks and it records all the noises, and they can run AI on that picks out the bellows of male koalas, and they can estimate population density from that. And so I'll talk a little bit more about one of the projects. We have been working with state government on one of those projects as well, and National Parks and Wildlife. And you can see we've focused around the Canangra Boyd area, and we've added in our own project there as well to get more data on the burn zones, because the statewide stuff is at a much broader scale than what we do, and it answers quite different questions. And then we've had quite a lot of on-ground in-person events with an audience of around close to 600 people, which has been great, lots of interest. And growing interest as koalas just seem to be keeping growing and popping up around these areas. It's really nice news. So in terms of what we've been focused on most recently, and this year in particular, with those ecological studies where we're radio tracking koalas, aside from fires that obviously have a really critical impact on populations, the longer term picture is climate change. And it doesn't have to be a fire. You can have changes in the chemistry in the leaves of trees and changes in the moisture levels, which means they might become unpalatable to koalas over time. And so it's really important to understand how the koalas use the landscape in different conditions. So on a really hot 30 or 40 degree day, where are they? And in winter, where are they? How do they move under these different conditions? Because if we know that can help us to predict what's going to be really important to them as things get hotter and drier under climate change. And so the way we've approached that is we've put out these little temperature things called eye buttons. You can't really see much in this picture. You'll see a bit of flagging tape and a Ziploc bag, and in that is a little device called an eye button, and it's just a temperature logger. So it records temperature on an hourly basis for 12 months or more. So we've put those out in the landscape on trees in gullies and on ridges and in between to try and measure the local landscape temperatures. And then we also put little temperature monitors on the koalas as well. And so we spread them across different topographies and microclimates. And just to explain a bit more, I won't go into too much technical detail, but for example, if people are looking at modeling koala occupancy or any species, there's layers that you can get on the internet for free that are satellite imagery. And you can just download them and get something called landforms. So you get a satellite image, and based on the topography, the slope and the elevation, you can break it up into, low valleys versus flat areas versus mid and high slopes. And you can see here, some quite big pixels just showing roughly where those categories come up. We took a different approach. We know that when you do this level of study, a lot of the data you get from remote satellites and also from weather stations. If you get your temperature data from a weather station, it's often kilometers, can be 50 kilometers away. And so it's not site specific. And so we measured that local temperature, and we also did some site specific modeling on the landscape. So we know that koalas like drainage lines and moisture in a lot of areas based on the literature. And so we thought, we don't necessarily, it's not helpful to know if they're just going to be on a mid or low slope. We want to know, are they using these microclimates that are based on these little creek lines and riparian waterways, which are called strata. And so, again, like with the temperatures, we took it down to a finer scale to try and understand where koalas were going under those different temperatures. And so we ran that at those 2 study sites this year. And this is where all that radio tracking data has come in as well. And we got some really interesting results. So we're hopefully getting a paper out next year, and I'm just giving you guys a sneak preview of the results. They're fascinating. We did find that gully microclimates are really important across both sites, which experience quite different conditions, but particularly in the warm season, which does make sense given, they get a lot of the moisture that they eat from the leaves. And so if you're wanting to restore habitats, for example, we know that you want to conserve those moister areas. Interestingly, there's been a lot of work more recently. People, if they restored habitats, used to focus on just planting the right food trees for koalas. And then it came out that shelter trees are also really important. And we know, for example, at our Wallamai site, that koalas will use the turpentines. You can see some in the background here, these thick understory trees that are a lot more shady. And so it makes sense to plant those understory trees. What we found, though, was up in Canangra, there were no shelter trees. Anybody who's been up there, there's a couple down in the really deep gullies, but up on the upper slopes and the ridge lines, you just don't see much difference in the canopy. And the koalas were just not selecting based on that. They were using the landscape in different ways. So they're actually going up at both sites, going up in elevations in certain weather. And for example, in really hot weather, they were going up into the western slope, and west is an exposed slope, so it's a bit surprising. You'd think more sun, but we have westerly prevailing winds, and we actually saw them sitting in the very tops of the trees using convective cooling, essentially, or air conditioning, just cooling down in the wind. And so it's not just gullies that are important or shelter trees, it's that variation in terrain that's really important to them. And we found the same thing with them using northern aspects in winter. So, you obviously much colder then, and you do get more sun in the north. So they were using radiant heating as well during winter. So it's, I was kind of expecting, well, we're going to find out that we need to plant trees in low moist gullies, but actually we need to protect sandstone ridgelines as well, so that they can use the landscape and to help regulate their temperature under these conditions. So that's some really exciting findings. So, and in terms of management, it's really important as well. So it comes back to that habitat restoration. It's not just about planting food trees and it's not just planting shelter trees either. It's knowing the physical characteristics of the landscape that you need to conserve. And there's a lot of areas where they won't necessarily have that choice either. So koalas do occur in quite flat areas. And we know from the fires, you've got this really varied steep terrain. And so you've got gullies where the fires just trickle through. And so you get patchy burn intensity. And it's the same thing with these microclimates. There's a nice choice of microclimates for them. You will have a lot of areas where you don't have all these little streams coming in and, you know, gully heads and microclimates for them to use. And so the fact that they exist here makes this a potentially really important area under climate change as a climate stronghold for koalas, and other areas that contain these sorts of variation are probably really important as well, along with a variety of habitats to choose from. So it's, yeah, we're coming up with some really interesting recommendations around what's important for koala conservation and which areas are really important. Then the other thing we've been working on this year, which is a big focus, is mapping new koala populations up around that Mudgee region, the broader Mudgee region, including Ralston and Louis. And going back to the community engagement side of things, like this is a classic story of how important it is for getting engaged with community. So anybody who's seen our last blog, you will have heard this story. But we had one person up in Louis, basically, Mick, who was just submitting sightings to us on a regular basis, saying there's koalas here, and giving us the data. And we kept submitting it to Bionet, and we got so much data together over time, you know, that the last few years, the numbers he was reporting that were independent koala sightings were just going up and up. So we thought this is looking like a really important area for koalas. So we managed to get a Commonwealth Government Saving Koalas Fund grant to go up and do some surveys. So we did some of the first stick surveys. You can see our current scat dog group here, sitting down, waiting quite patiently but eagerly, ready to go and search for some koala poop. What we found is a lot of the online vegetation maps are not particularly accurate, particularly in the World Heritage Area here because it's so diverse. And so we do have to go in ground truth and basically ID all the tree species in the area to see what sort of vegetation community we're in, and figure out which trees are important to koalas by looking at which tree the scat is under. And so there are some challenges around using scat detection dogs like Groot. I do personally really like working with the herding dogs because they're very directable. You can say, go left, go right, go up that slope, and, you know, they can understand English, which is really good. Also incredibly smart, which brings its own training challenges. So they'll pick stuff up really quickly, but then they'll also try and cheat and train you back, essentially. So, for example, with Groot, he would, if I was training him and I'd plant a koala scat, he would just follow the scent of where I'd walked or anybody else had walked. So I'd have to lay a really big false trail, a big zigzag, so that he would then work out it was quicker to follow the wind to get to the scat and to get to his ball reward than it was to follow me. And he's also quite willful, so it's just been interesting. But he's a champion scat dog. He's been outperforming Springer Spaniels and finding more scats than they do, and just loves the work, really high work ethic. So he's a great scat dog. He's one of our superpowers. This is just an example of the work. So we are bringing together a whole range of data. So we use the community signings, we use any other smaller scale survey data that's been provided. So National Parks and Wildlife have done some acoustic song meter studies up in Munghorn Gap. So we took that data. So this is not a final map. So yeah, don't share it or take anything from it. But basically we pull all that data together and we'll end up with a koala habitat map. So showing highly preferred habitat where there's a lot of records and we know koalas are either there in some patches and love it, but it's also, you know, got certain food trees and things that they might also move into other areas of it over time, through to possible habitat, through to something that's unclassified. So that'll be the end result of that Louis and Mudgee area work for this stage. And then going into the 2025 plans. So we're going to continue with the koala work amongst some other work. Surprise, surprise, because it just keeps getting more interesting. This is a koala at Blackheath, sitting right near a fence at a lookout called Hargraves Lookout that came through this year. We've had a lot of sightings in Blackheath and Katoomba. We've heard bellows, and we've also confirmed some records down in the lower mountains. And none of the broader scale surveys that have been done under the new statewide surveys are picking those animals up, just because they're focused at a much larger scale. And so we're hoping to confirm and finally document resident koalas in those areas. So I think these guys up on the northern side are moving across from the Canangra Boyd population, which we know is booming. There's so many healthy animals out there breeding every year. So yeah, we'll continue trying to identify and map the new populations, and then we're going to continue our climate change study. While the results have been really interesting, we haven't actually had a really hot, dry summer yet, and so it's really important to try and get that longitudinal data to see where koalas go under that really extreme weather. You know, fortunately, we have had some really nice climate over the last few years. And then something else, one of the projects that I mentioned earlier that we want to get off the ground, and we're in discussions with a potential donor at the moment for that, is to continue our critical weight range mammals. So those are animals that are 5 kilos or under, that are really susceptible to predation by foxes and cats. So they include a lot of our threatened species. And we have done previous 2 rounds of camera traps previously, where we put 90 cameras out over 3 sites. Just after the fires, and then a couple of years later. We had a lot of citizen scientists involved online in that, getting on and classifying the photos for us. We went through 750,000 images, which is pretty amazing, and got some really interesting results out of that. So we had I mentioned quite a few of the collaborating organisations earlier, but you can see here a lot of people, and 150 volunteers were involved in our camera trap projects to date. We found something really interesting in that, again, 2 years after fire, the unburnt areas were significantly important for these critical weight range mammals. So even compared to the low intensity burns, which is interesting because all the control burning that's being done, you know, it's assumed that a low intensity burn doesn't have much impact, but it still has a significant impact compared to an unburnt area. So again, it's that question of, well, when do they start moving into those higher burnt areas, you know, so that significant difference disappears. And so we're hoping to at least one of our sites to get in and put the camera traps out 5 years later now, and to see what we find. Yeah, and you can just see here, you know, foxes and cats. So while we put the cameras out focused on those animals, we also look at the invasive species and see if they correlate as well. Did I just hear someone chatting? No, I'll just carry on. Nearly done. Yeah, so we've got that really interesting information started on things, and got some really interesting information, but we still need to find out how it changes over time. So it's that longitudinal data that's really important, which is why we're still trying to get stage 2 or 3 to a lot of our projects, because, you know, you have that immediate response, and there were a lot of grants available after the bushfires, but they've really dried up now, and the questions are still really pertinent because we don't have the information to properly inform management on what to do around fire refugia over the longer term for animals. You know, how long do you need to protect them for? Is it 5 years? Is it 10? We don't know yet. And then Zambia, I was just going to outline really briefly around that. The big gap that we're trying to fill there is a lot of the conservation work, particularly in Zambia, but I think across a lot of the wildlife areas in Africa, it's very much focused on anti-poaching, which is a really big threat. It's, you know, it's very needed, that management effort, but it's not based on science and ecology. So in a lot of areas, there's still a lack of monitoring and evaluation. So for example, if there's a lot of work on doing anti-poaching to try and protect elephants, there's not necessarily a lot of work counting the elephants to see, well, is what they're doing effective? Are the elephants' populations growing or declining in response? And a lot of the work that's done just isn't you know, the baseline's really low. I actually worked in Africa for about a decade, and the national park that I started in, there wasn't even a vegetation map, and there was no baseline data on all the animal populations. And so you need that knowledge before, really ideally before you do the management, but certainly to inform it and measure it. And then while it's critical that all these anti-poaching efforts are done, it's a single threatening process. And so you've got disease, you've got habitat encroachment and fragmentation, you've got climate change, all of the things we're dealing with here, although the invasive predators certainly aren't as big a problem. So you've got threatening processes that aren't even being looked at because all of the funding's going into anti-poaching, or the vast majority of it. And then if you look at the animals that are being protected or that are the focus of the anti-poaching, that are, you know, that are being shot like elephants or being snared, including the large predators, it's still only 5% of the biodiversity in the country. And so there's a huge gap. And so that's what we're aiming to help fill once we get on the ground over there. So just briefly on how you can help, we might be going a little bit over time depending on questions. So we did start a little bit late. Please report your koala sightings if you live in the local area. Like, it's amazing what it can lead to. So you can either report them to us. If you are local, please report them to us. We'll still give them to state and federal government. We share them regularly, but it means we have them early. They don't always appear quickly in some of those systems, and it means we can use them for the local research. If you're outside of the World Heritage Area, nowhere near Sydney or the Blue Mountains, put them straight into the new Commonwealth app, which is called the Koala Spotters app, which is a really good app. Sign up to volunteer. We do have ongoing radio tracking, which it takes several sessions to train up for, and you need to have a fair bit of time and commitment for that. But we do have things like the camera trap project, hopefully coming up next year, where we'll need people to come out and help put out cameras and go through online images and that sort of thing. So although you mightn't hear from us for a while, we will get back to you when the opportunities come up. And then as a not-for-profit, we very much appreciate any donations. So please feel free to support us. Also, if you're looking for a Christmas present, we have Adopt a Koala for the person who has everything except a warm and fuzzy feeling for protecting wildlife. If you go to our, excuse me, our website, you'll see how to adopt a koala. There's a range of different packages there. And just quick thank you to all our supporters and collaborators that are listed here.